hello and welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. Absolutely delighted that you would join us today as we continue to hear from leaders right around the globe, but particularly in our region of the world. And that is definitely the case today as we are joined by Jonathan Dove. Jonathan, it's so great to have you on the podcast today.
Kia ora. Good to be here.
So good. Now, immediately, as people have heard your voice and your accent, of course, you are not from Australia. You are from across the ditch in Auckland, New Zealand. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Jonathan, about where you're based, about some of the things you put your hands to. Tell us about yourself.
So, senior pastor at Grace City Church in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. Also founding executive chair for Auckland Church Network. So kind of a coalition of very diverse churches from Pentecostal to Catholic, Anglican, Evangelical, all coming together. We can talk about that a bit later. And then married for 28 years. Yikes, that's dating me.
Wow.
With four living kids between the ages of 12 and 18, and our late son, Toby Jake.
Wow.
So yeah, I'm very privileged to be a dad too.
Amazing. Well, of course, we're going to dive into the wide range of things that you just mentioned, but I wonder, just particularly for those who are hearing your name for the first time, of course, we're going to jump into the many, many different things that I value about you and the different ways that you're serving the church in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But give us a bit of a thumbnail about, how have you found yourself where you are today, some of your ministry experience to date. Tell us about some of your ministry journey.
Yeah, I'd say really probably for all of us, grace is this beautiful common theme for my life. And so grew up in a open brethren church. It's a very kind of conservative background, which was great training for a male communicator / leader. It's a phenomenal time for me. And then found myself, just getting, coming to faith at the age of 10. And then around the same time, just having a real sense of wanting to do what I'm doing now as a pastor. And I went from being a shy kid at school to wanting to lead things. So it was quite a profound change for me, even just at that kind of 10, 11 years of age. And then my wife and I got married. We did some study in New Zealand, then Australia, and some postgraduate study in Dallas, Texas, of all places.
Wow.
Serving in a mega church over there, and learned that actually large churches can be healthy churches and small churches can be healthy churches and vice versa. And it was a great time. And then found myself in a Baptist church here in New Zealand. And then for the last 10 years have been in charismatic, evangelical, very multicultural church that we call Grace City. And we named it Grace City a few years ago just because we had a shocking history with all sorts of issues and serious fraud allegations from before my time, and all sorts of stories that maybe can be a podcast for another time. But it reminded me again of the way God still in his grace saves people. And then even my own family. I call it my grace family because if you take the acronym of each of my children, along with my wife, it spells grace. And it was never intentional, but reminds me, particularly after 7 years of trying to have kids but couldn't, and then losing one at birth, to have this grace family is a constant reminder to me of God's goodness.
That's beautiful, JD. And of course, as you lead that out in terms of your own ministry context, and I just love that definitely is something I have observed about you as a leader, that you're a man of great grace and you have a deep investment in the kingdom coming in New Zealand. And you're also one of those guys that, particularly as we've spent time with one another, you take me as one of those leaders and one of those men that has thought very deeply about ecosystems. Like you've actually done some very thorough consideration and thinking about what does it mean for the church, not just one church, to actually make an impact on a city, a region, a country. How about, to begin our time today, you'd begin to tell us about some of that journey and how you got to that point. And of course, you mentioned before the Auckland Church Leaders Network. Talk to us about how that came about. That's kind of a living, breathing example of, I guess, some of that theory and practice.
Yeah, no, it's if you cut me, I'm going to bleed unity. So I just believe unity and mission, right? So I guess if we go back a little bit, we all have these moments in life that define us. I call it kind of our Nehemiah moments. And if you remember that story in the Old Testament, that Nehemiah moment, it's when Nehemiah hears about the broken walls in Jerusalem. His heart is torn. He allows his heart to dislocate, even though he's like 1,500 kilometers away from like Jerusalem to Persia, where he is. For me, I was in Auckland. I'd heard stories about unity movements, particularly in New York. So the late Timothy Keller, Mac Peer, who continues to lead that leadership movement in New York. And their vision, this is going back probably about 20 years ago, their vision was to have 10% of everyone in Manhattan connected to a gospel-believing church. Wow. within a generation. And at the time, it was only like 1%. I believe it's now like 5 or 6%. And so that this vision and to see what had happened, 10, 15 years later was just inspiring for me. Around the same time, I had a couple of conversations, I guess that spoke to me of the importance of unity, of people that just said, oh, well, we can never see that in Auckland because it's just too competitive. We often have that unofficial church mission statement of we do church better, and we never publish that, but it kind of feels like that. That's kind of our city. And then around that time again, I was invited to lead our Auckland Church Leaders Group. So it's almost like a coffee group for senior executive type pastors, in the sense of, these are bishops from Catholic, Anglican, leaders of Salvation Army, the Baptist denominational leader, kind of all that kind of group, and then our large Pentecostal churches. So that all come together 4 times a year, have lunch, share some stories. And they asked me to lead that right at the end of 2019. And as I prayed about it, I said, well, yeah, I'd love to do that. But it was kind of a yes, but, I'd like to explore what it actually looks like to be better together. And I was honest as I started to meet with people one-on-one over coffees within that group to say, we use this phrase, we're better together. It feels like a cliche. Can we actually point to anything we have done that would actually validate that?
Wow.
And so for me, all of that came together in what I would call this Nehemiah moment, where we all kind of leaned in those lunches and said, well, yeah, let's try something. And so suddenly all this momentum started to come as people wanted to try something and lean in. It got beyond what I could effectively do as a volunteer. And so I brought somebody on staff, just completely devoted into that space. And obviously I needed to therefore raise funds into this. And I'd never recruited anybody without funds before, but this was one of those moments where I felt like had a coffee with somebody and laid out this vision that I had for the city, and he just responded to it. Fantastic guy, his name's Ben Mai, and he was in a senior leadership role at a not-for-profit charity in our city at the time. But it came back to me within days to say, JD, I'm in, which obviously meant I needed to now raise money for his full-time salary. And I remember leaving that meeting. I had another meeting at another place in the city, and I'd never been to this place before. And I was coming out, and just in the foyer, somebody stopped me and said, "Are you Jonathan Dove?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Oh, could we step into this other room to chat for a bit?" I got a little bit worried, as you do. And then he said, "I've heard about the vision you have for the city. I'd like to give like $20,000 towards that." Yeah. And for me, it was just this validating moment of like same day, just somebody going, "Here, here's something to start you off with." Wow. And then from that, we were able to get other funding, and now have 2 full-time staff in that space. And but it really led to a lot of leaders coming together. We had an overnight retreat, and just sitting with passages like Jeremiah 29, where we work and pray for the flourishing of the city. Having a Zoom call with people like Mac Peer in New York, and just being inspired by that. And that led to what we have now as Auckland Church Network. And I can unpack some of the pillars we designed and specifics, but that gives you kind of the background of, I guess, my moment and trying to go, I need to do something about the broken walls. Yeah. Because somebody, we often have that idea of, somebody somewhere needs to do something about it, but we just we just get busy. But this was one of those moments for me where it felt like, okay, God's calling me to do something. And so I stood out in my uncomfortable moments of wondering how this was going to go. But it's just been a beautiful story.
Jonathan, that's incredible. And I particularly take my hat off to you and your faith, and for anyone who's met you and Ben Mai, both two of the most genuine, kingdom generous people that you would hope to meet. And I think particularly, in terms of our Aussie Kiwi relationship, sometimes we jokingly have a bit of antagonism, but I think quite genuinely we're in a place as Aussies where, I guess we would see and understand that New Zealand could be ahead 5-10 years when it comes to secularism, when it comes to the desperation of the church in this cultural moment. But I think some of the things that you're speaking to and the need for unity are so significant in this moment. And I guess I do want to push into those pillars that you just mentioned towards the end of your response to that previous question, because I think some of those key ingredients are really helpful for us as church leaders and people that have a heart for the kingdom to understand. And so I'd love you to just kind of spend some time talking about some of what you discovered.
Yeah, so people can go to Auckland Church Network .co.nz and see the pillars themselves. But, just to go through them, first is obviously pray. Every unity movement that I'm aware of has always begun with a prayer movement first and foremost. So how that's expressed for us, we began this probably 3-4 years ago now, something called the Daily. So just during Lent, we shoot these 2 to 3 minute video devotions, getting a bunch of very diverse leaders from every denomination, male, female, different ages of leaders, and different devotion goes out through social media and through Christian TV and radio here. And it just reminds people, here's this thought, and we're all coming around this to be part of something bigger. We have just brought in 24/7 prayer, international into New Zealand to start 24/7 prayer. Aotearoa have a wonderful New Zealand director, Sam Harvey, leading the charge in that space. But again, just going, we need to have a prayer movement. And so we were instrumental in helping that come about. Prayer breakfast at Eden Park. We just 2 weeks ago, 700 leaders all met in the room to just lean in and pray together.
Wow.
And then we introduced a Holy Ground app. So people right now over these next couple of weeks are walking different streets in our city, and you can see where people are walking, and it's just bringing people together to pray. So that would be like the prayer pillar. Second one would be connect. So, Auckland's like 1.7 million people. Can't all kind of come together in one pastoral group for churches. So we're just inviting pastors to come together in different geographical groups and ethnic groups across the city. And so we're working hard into that space. We have another pillar for support, so things like church planting, part of the way we support different churches in that space, even just bringing people together to go, well, we want to support a conversation around, let's say, faith and politics. So a key event we had a couple of years ago was bringing our 5 political parties together, our key MPs, along with pastors, and having almost like TED Talks from both groups across the political spectrum.
Wow.
Where MPs from far left and far right are speaking along with pastors from large Pentecostal through to our Catholic bishop, and we're all listening to each other. And even when some of the leaders came into the room that day and looked at who was in the room, some of them wanted to leave, but they decided to stay, and we I guess protected and provided respectful time. But by the end of that, it was that sense of, we want this to be a moment where you can get on the phone and call each other. And so a beautiful moment of I guess, bringing people together. That would be their support space. And then declare, how do we declare Jesus across our city through evangelism campaigns? How do we inspire people for service? So I guess just to mention a couple of examples in that space would be recently I just pulled together a disaster recovery group. We had a lot of flooding here in Auckland a couple of years ago. So just inviting churches to start really thinking about, how do we respond to disaster next time it comes? Let's make sure we're ready in that space with trained people in our churches, perhaps warehouses that might even have supplies that can go out quickly. Currently, there's a good dialogue for a back-to-school project where churches could rally together, getting backpacks with school supplies, sending out in partnership to local schools in the area. So there's different initiatives, and it's just so wonderful to inspire that space and almost bring have an umbrella group that even groups like disability sectors feel like they can come under and go, well, we need to have a conversation about X, and we were able to bring groups together in a way that possibly can't do so by themselves. So that's been a beautiful payoff for us.
It's great. It feels like a very intentional way that you have been able to work out how you can accurately serve your cities and your nation in a way that actually brings the church together. I'm putting you on the spot here, JD, but are there any good news stories that you can point to and go, oh, that was just a real signpost of the kingdom as churches were able to come together in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say a number of those happen regularly, but I think the one that inspires me the most, and perhaps we'll come to this again in a moment to unpack it, but our church planting learning community is one that I get most excited about right now. Just to see people leaning in on this space to learn about planting together, where they're not competing, but they actually want to help each other. And maybe we'll come back to that one. The other one would be when we had this retreat, it's an overnight retreat to form those pillars. There was this magical moment for me when we were all like brainstorming different things we could do, and suddenly one of our largest Pentecostal churches in the city had this idea of a campaign promoting, the name of Jesus on billboards across the city and different ideas around that. And then our Catholic bishop at the time leaned in and said, oh, yeah, we have like all these billboards outside our like private schools, and you could use that space. And suddenly the two of them are like dreaming together and strategizing on how that could be. And, for me, regardless on how that campaign might go, it's just going, the real story is that a Catholic and a Pentecostal came together and had this shared dream to promote Jesus across our city. And I just think that's really cool.
Yeah, praise God. Well, Jonathan, you've just mentioned, of course, which I wanted to get to today, around the learning community that you have been helping to facilitate and host in New Zealand for the better part of the last 12 months. At time of release, it'll probably be closer to 15 months when people are hearing this podcast. But I'd love you to dive in firstly. How did that come about? Of course, you said that you bleed unity. In that room, you've been able to gather together a eclectic, diverse group of churches and denominational representation. How did that come about? And I guess secondly, for those who are hearing that term learning community for the first time, explain to folk what that is. And we're going to get to it in a little while longer, because I want to hear what that's meant for you and for Grace City, because I know that's been very instrumental in your journey as you guys have set about imagining what it could look like to plant not just one, but several churches going forwards. But let's backtrack a bit. Tell us about the groups that are in the room, how it came about, what is a learning community?
Sure. So I guess to understand the New Zealand context, we don't really have any sizable church planting organisations established here in New Zealand. So I'm aware in Australia you have a number of different groups that have full-time people in those spaces who are wonderfully encouraging church planting. That's not our story in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so realising the gap that's there and the terrible way that churches were trying to step out to do something without having any idea what they were doing. We identified a few leaders and said, well, let's go across to Exponential in Florida and just, big church planning aspect in Exponential, don't have to talk to you about this, Charlie, Exponential. And just to see what might happen. And so 12 of us went across and we were just so inspired. And then from, while we were there, we were just going, well, something needs to happen here in New Zealand. How do we do it? And so when we came back, it was that sense of trying to think through, well, do we invite one of these organisations to come to New Zealand and start that? And at the time, we just thought, actually, a better way forward, at least for this season we're in, is we want to have like real church plants happening, not just think our next step is creating an organisation to do that. And so I reached out to a friend of mine by the name of Brent Dolfu, who's Vancouver-based and consulted with a number of large churches before, and asked for his help in this. So Brent has done a lot in that learning community space. And I know it's pretty common now to just rebrand any conference as a learning community. That's not what a genuine learning community is.
Yeah.
A genuine one has more of that idea of having a hypothesis where you're like building and you're measuring and you're learning in that space, and you're coming together. So it might be half content, which inspires, but then mostly workshop where you're coming around a plan and you go, this is our hypothesis. We believe if we do X, we're going to get Y result. And you're going to put some measurements to know whether you get those results in or not. And then you're learning from each other. So a phrase we often use is we don't want to pay the stupid tax. If we can learn from each other and be vulnerable enough to actually share our plan and share our learnings and share our failings, we can all go a lot further through this space together. So that's effectively what it is. And so we have 12 different groups from large churches and small churches and denominations and independent churches, groups like Elam and Māori Anglican and Wesleyan and Open Brethren and large Pentecostals all coming together with planting plans across different areas in New Zealand and stepping out. And so we have Brent Dolfu and then Bishop Rick Thorpe stepping in to help us in that space. So it's been a phenomenal time.
Absolutely. I mean, even to be able to venture over and sit in the room with you guys for a day or two was an absolute pleasure. And we're delighted that there's more and more of that happening in Australia too, because I think, as you've rightly explained, there's a big difference between sitting on a conference or a seminar, as good as they might be, and yet when you are covenanting to commit to an accountability process where you bear it all, warts and all, for want of a better term, the best and the worst, and actually realize we are prototyping and working towards something. Sometimes that requires us swallowing our ego and actually going, well, I'm here to learn from others, from good content, but most of all to sharpen a workshop. Actually, how are we going to be about the Lord's business in our region? I think it's hugely significant. And I guess what I wanted to ask next, Jonathan, was tell us about Grace City's journey in that, because that has and I'm sure it's been a journey. It's been, definitely the last 12 months, but probably well before then as well. That's actually starting to reap some fruit for you guys.
Yeah, and so a few years ago, I would have been one of those people that would have said, oh, you're church planning, maybe somebody needs to do that somewhere, sometime. But theologically, I had, I guess, an awakening moment a few years ago where it's just like every time I reread the book of Acts now, I'm like, how did I not see church planting before this? How did I not read the Great Commission as involving the need to plant churches and new churches? Wow. And so everything for me as a leader and the way I pastor, the way I lead now has radically changed these past couple of years. And so for Grace City, we're kind of a sizable multicultural church in Green Lane, which is like central Auckland, 55 different countries of origin. And we would never have said it, but it was just that sense of, well, we just need to do things better and continue to grow and add people on. Now we have more of a multiplication vision where we're wanting to think about how we multiply disciples and groups and leaders and mission and locations. And so our model of church planting, and everyone needs to choose their own model, but for us, it's around multiplying locations, starting new church plants that are part of a multi-site model. So we call it locally empowered, centrally resourced multi-site church, having the closeness of a family and the resource of a village. So trying to have like big church and little church being able to come together, the best of big and small, right? So for us, we adopted a church 2.5-3 years ago to make 2 locations, and then February next year, so just 3-4 months from now, we will be planting in southeast Auckland, which we're really excited about. So we have a planter. We have actually after this call, I'm getting in the car and going off to look at a venue that we're going to be meeting at, and we're just going to be beginning with Alpha. And with community ministries, once that's established over 10-12 weeks, we'll then begin services. But we want to see the church actually beginning right in that evangelistic heart where there's small groups happening, and then we'll wrap around these Sunday gatherings into that space too. But we're quite excited to step into that. And already our staff team here and many leaders, as the congregation hears about that, going, oh, what's the next plant? And we haven't even started this plant, but people are starting to go, I think the next 2 locations should be, and I'm hearing some of that and people leaning in. So to be honest, Charlie, it feels like an adventure. And I think I love my job more than I ever have done, because it just feels like the adventure of mission once again.
So good. Well, JD, at time of release of this podcast, it'll probably be around February 2025. So we are celebrating with you the fact that in faith,
Awesome.
you guys
and
are,
please pray. Lots of prayer, please.
right. You guys are or about to plant that church, and we're so excited with you, particularly. And I love how you just shared that it's been a bit of a philosophical shift for you. Like, I think a lot of us here in the West are kind of realizing that, of course, we want to lead and grow great churches. But actually, there is a whole kingdom at hand that one church, it's in and of itself, whether it's multi-site or wherever it might be, we cannot steward that. We need to actually release it in order to see the kingdom advance. And so, like, particularly, like, really honing in on that, JD, talk to us about that philosophical shift. Talk to us about, like, what were some of the changes that you had to make in leadership, in your staff team? I imagine there would have been some kind of adjustments that had to be made. Like, how did that go over the course of those learning communities every 6 months where you went, oh, this is messy. I'm sure it didn't go all to plan. Like, just let us pull back the veil a little bit there.
Yeah, so it was messy. Certainly, the very first time we sat down and started to create a vision, a multiply vision or an M5 around the different areas we wanted to multiply, realizing everything here needs to go differently. How we define success now is not around just how many people have added into some program or event, but how we multiply people. And so thinking about things like an apprentice leader. Before, when I would recruit staff, I would think about bringing, the best people I could find from outside of our church and kind of, having a bit of a coffee and recruiting them to come across. And now I'm thinking about, well, who do we already have in our church, believing God's already raised up everybody and everything we need, but they need training. And so it changes the way I see people in their space now. And so often even bringing people into a role where somebody's not quite ready for it, but developing a plan to help them get to where they need to be through very intentional coaching. And so, and then we've had to develop a central ministries support hub and bring staff on and reorient some staff to just be thinking about how we resource particular ministries across Grey City. And then how do we locally empower location pastors? So my role has changed in that I'm no longer, or about to no longer lead our largest campus, but kind of handing that over and raising somebody else into that space so that I can pull back and think about multiplication. And so I become effectively the multiplication pastor, looking for leaders and how do I raise them up and resource and make sure these things are happening. So, but it takes time. Certainly takes a lot of time. When people first hear something, they might get excited, but don't realize the pain in that journey. But I wouldn't, even knowing the pain of that now, I wouldn't change anything. There's obviously things I would do to lead differently, but it's such an adventure, such a good thing to be part of. And to be honest, Charlie, that the same's true for the unity movement. I think people. I read scripture differently in that space too now. So when I read things like make every effort to pursue the unity of the spirit and the bond of peace, I used to almost see that as like a weapon verse. When somebody disagreed with me, I could kind of pull out Ephesians 4. But I reread that now to go, well, what does it look like to pursue the unity within the capital C church across, how am I speaking about other pastors and leaders and churches to be bringing blessing upon them and not ripping them to shreds. That this is what Scripture. We're one Lord, one church, one baptism. This is across churches, not just our own local church, right? So I think we as leaders often need to change our paradigm. And often our congregation members are further ahead in the unity space and even the multiplication space than what often we are.
That's great. Well, JD, I was about to ask you what's hot in your spirit and give us an encouragement to finish off, but I actually think that's a brilliant place to finish our conversation because I actually think in many ways like I kind of said before, you in New Zealand are probably 5-10 years ahead by way of secularization. And if we can't be learning from those who are really on the frontier of mission in a post-Christian culture, just a reminder for us as the church in Australia, this is the main game. It's the 84% of people in Australia that don't have any connection to the current structure of the church. And so how can we best do that? It's in unity, it's by loving one another, it's by being on mission together. So if there's anything else you wanted to throw in the mix there, Jonathan, but it's been an absolute pleasure to have you today.
Yes, wonderful time. Thanks, Charlie.